What was food like on southern plantations?
So on southern plantations, there were, for at least for African Americans, there were two feeding systems. So first you had the big house cooking. So that's where the master and his family lived, and often they had enslaved African and African American cooks making their food. So they had tried to mimic what foods you would get in Europe and other places, and tried to live the high life there. So that's where dishes like fried chicken, different cakes, some of the really fancy southern food, that's where that was cooked. But for the field slaves, they had an entirely different type of food that was cooked for them. So usually the cook for the field slaves was someone who was old and feeble and couldn't really do the daily labor. And so they were charged with cooking. So the typical day was like this. You would get up at a little bit before sunrise, and you'd have to go to a trough basically and get buttermilk mixed with cornbread, and people had to eat all of that up. So that was breakfast. Then you go out into the fields, you work for a few hours until noon, and then at noon you come back. That same trough is now washed out, and inside there will be vegetables with maybe a little meat there to season it. And so you'd have greens or black-eyed peas or any kind of vegetable in there. And again, people had to eat out of the trough. And typically what happened is that the solid food would go to the adults, and then the liquid would go to the kids. So that liquid is what we call pot liquor. So pot liquor has nothing about getting your drink on. It's just about the broth that vegetables were cooked in. So it had a lot of nutrients, and people knew that it was good for you, and so kids would often get that and not the solid food. And then you'd have to work until sundown, and then at sundown you'd have to go back to your slave quarters, your cabin, and then you'd have to eat leftovers. So a piece of cold cornbread, and if there was anything left over from lunch, maybe that. Other than that, you had to essentially get your own food. You had to either hunt it, you had to fish for it, or raise it in your own private garden. And it depended from plantation to plantation whether or not you were allowed to raise your own food. Typically, a plantation had a ration system. So once a week, there would be an allotment of cornmeal, an allotment of pork or fish or some kind of meat that was either smoked or salted because it had to be preserved, and then some molasses. So often when people talk about Southern food, they talk about the 3 M's, meat, meal, and molasses. Well, that's where that comes from. So you get a few pounds of each of these things, and you had to stretch that out for your family. And sometimes this was mandated by law, but other times the plantation owner, the master, was just trying to figure out how much he could subsist on it, his slaves could subsist on this food without him spending a lot of money, because it's an economics game. You're trying to make as much money as you can out of this plantation and keep your costs low. So it was a mixture of those two things. And that's what food was like on most southern plantations. Again, it varies from plantation to plantation, but that's kind of the overarching look at it.